Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started with Intacct reports today. All right. So when I sent out the invitation to register, I had some questions shared or asked and got responses. So we're going to look at those first before we get in. So I asked, what report do you access most often in Intacct? Basically, your typical financial report, the budget, what we've spent, how much is available, is by far the most commonly accessed report for our users. Are we familiar with a method called process and store for running reports offline? Vast majority said no. And that leads us to the last part, this little word cloud of, I asked, what's the most challenging thing you have when you're accessing a report? And long time, wait time, stuff like that was the most common answer, which ties back to this process and store. In Intacct, as each year goes on and our database gets longer, reports, particularly the life-to-date reports, are going to take longer and longer to run. So Intacct's recommended method of running life-to-date reports is called process and store. So we'll look at an example of how that works once we get into running the reports, and hopefully that would help with some of your frustrations. Here's the agenda we'll be going through today. We're going to run both of the financial reports, fiscal year and life to date. We're going to look at running a general ledger dimension balance report. In some of the responses, there were concerns about how do we access budget information, that kind of stuff. A dimension balance report for your funding sources, whether it's for 1 year or the life of the funding source, that thing takes like 20 seconds to run. So this is probably another good alternative method for you to use when we see that today. And then last, there is another report called Purchasing Transaction Blanket Purchase Order Detail. So I just want to look at that so we can see how to research our blanket purchase orders through a report. So some of the key terms we will probably hear throughout this presentation is the fiscal year, which is the Intacct is designed to function within the tribe's fiscal year, October 1 to September 30th. Most of our funding sources work that way, but we do have some programs and grants that don't run within the tribe's fiscal year. Programs like the transit program, diabetes, they have grants that run January to December. Head Start has funds that run April to March and then September to August. And so when we're talking fiscal year, like the fiscal year reports, this is specifically set to match the tribe's fiscal year. Encumbrances or commitments is the requisitions we use to place for property, goods, contract services during a period that places a hold on the budget to prevent future spending. So we'll see the encumbrances run with our financial reports. Accrual is the reporting book used to record revenue and expense activity. So when we get into dimension balance reports, we have to choose the type of book we're going to use. And the encumbrance book also goes with that report. So our expenses and our encumbrances are kept in two different books within the general ledger. So we're going to look at that too. So our financial reports presented in Intacct is one of the many reports available to users and it's the most commonly accessed report in Intacct. We use it to provide insight into how our programs are operating, how efficient we are with managing the funds, and of course for budget performance to see how we're doing now, and then for planning purposes like with the upcoming fiscal year planning for fiscal year 23. Revenues on these reports may not reflect actual receipts and may just be the income reported as accrued, not necessarily received. That's more an item for like accounts receivable based funds and grants. Solid waste, when they send us a bill for our solid waste monthly, the revenue is accrued when the invoice is created, not when the payment is received. But on their financial reports, when they run a revenue and expense report, it's already recorded as revenue earned, revenue accrued. And that ties with this last part here about financial reports do not include all of your financial activity. When we run a fiscal year or a life-to-date revenue and expense report, that's only reporting on those two specific types of activity. Doesn't include our cash activity, activity with assets, or our accounts payable, accounts receivable, or any other type of balance sheet transaction. The fiscal year reports and life-to-date reports for revenue and expenses give us one of the aspects of how our fund is operated, and most of us are only concerned with that because that's where we spend our budget. So the fiscal year reports in Intacct are primarily created to serve these 5 types of funding sources. General funds operate on a year-to-year basis, so we're going to use the fiscal year reports when we want to report on what we've spent, what our budget is, and what we have available to continue to spend. Same thing with funds that rely on casino revenue, funds that rely on indirect cost revenue, single year grants where their fiscal year matches the tribes, and then finally revenue funds. If you have a funding source that falls in one of those 5 categories, you're using the fiscal year report. For life-to-date reports, 638 contracts, IHS contracts, multi-year grants, and single-year grants where the fiscal year doesn't match the tribes. Like in the examples I gave earlier for Head Starts that run April to March, we're using a life-to-date report because the life-to-date report does exactly that. It grabs the activity for the life of that funding source. So in a situation like Head Starts where they run from April to March, a fiscal year report is only going to grab part of that activity for the funding source. A life-to-date report would grab both of those because their fiscal year straddles 2 different fiscal years for the tribe. All right, so let's get into Intacct. I'm using a demo account, so this is like a employee level account. So any of the reports or steps I'm taking here, any user in Intacct can take. It's not just an administrative or finance employee person that can do this. So as users, when we go to run a financial report, we're going to go to our menu, we're going to reports, and then we're going to the report center. And depending on our access, the list of reports available to us to run will be displayed here. It's going to show all reports, likely all applications, and today the 2 reports I'm going to run from this screen are going to be under the financial reports area, so you can either have it on all applications or finance reports. Either or, both will work. So we're going to run the fiscal year report for this one. The user account I'm using has access to a general funded program and checkbook, so that's what we're going to base the report on today. If I'm going to run the fiscal year expenses one funding source view report, this is going to give me a report showing one funding source and just the expenses. The one I'm running doesn't have revenue, so I'm not worried about revenue on this one. But we're going to do this as a process and stored report so we can see how that works, since that's not something we're familiar with. But before we do that, we need to make sure that in our user preferences, we've enabled that Intacct can email us or notify us when the process and stored report is available. So before I start to run this report, I'm going to go up here and click on my name and go to my preferences. And we're going to go about a third or so of the page down. There's an area that says email notifications. And here it asks, stored reports are generated and available. It's unchecked, meaning if I process and store a report, Intact's not going to tell me when it's ready. So I'm going to check that and save that option. And now let's go back to our report center. So we're going to run that fiscal year expense one funding source view report. But instead of clicking on the text like we're used to, on this screen at the very last column is an option that says more actions. So if I click that and go to process and store, It's going to give me a box to run the report, but something different will happen rather than the report running on our screen and running on our computer. So when do we run the report on? It defaults to current day. I want the report to run now, so I'm going to leave it to current day. What this also means is you can schedule a report to run into the future. So if you wanted to schedule a report for yourself to run on Monday morning, or whenever a day in the future is important to you, you can change that date. I want it to run today, so I'm gonna leave it at today. And just like running a financial report, we're gonna use our checkbook, our program, and our funding source. Next, as of date, for what period of time do we want the report to run? If it's as of today, the fiscal year will be this fiscal year with all information run through the most available, most current information through today. And that's what we want, so that's what I'm going to use. And then the last part of this is how do we want this report to be delivered when we process and store it? Every instance for us, we're going to leave Store in Intacct selected. What format do we want the report to run in? Our options are HTML, which is the normal, if we clicked on the text of the report and then ran it on screen, that's that format. Do you want to see it in that format? Printable, which means PDF, CSV, or Excel. So which format do we want the report to be delivered to us as? I'm gonna leave it as HTML for this one. And then we can hit OK. And it's going to tell us the report is being processed. Check my stored reports for the report results. We've also enabled that we'll get an email once the report is ready. So I'm going to close that screen. At the top of our reports is a hyperlink to a space that says View Stored Reports. So if I click that, that report has already run that quickly for us. So there's a blue hyperlink where if I click that, the report's going to open. We can see a second one that says in process. Before the presentation started, I scheduled a report to run tomorrow. So it says in process. Once the report is done running tomorrow, it's going to say Excel with a blue link to Excel so I can download the report tomorrow. And a life-to-date report's going to work the same way. Life-to-date expenses, one funding source view report. More actions, process and store. Through today. Here's my checkbook and my program and my funding source. And this time I want it as a PDF instead of HTML. We're going to get that same message, reports being processed, check my stored reports for the report results. It's a life-to-date report, so this one's going to take a little longer than a fiscal year report. And so if I go back to View Stored Reports, it's in process. Now what the process and store does is it runs the report process on Intacct servers and not your computer. So if you've experienced running a life-to-date report, it's going to take a long time. You're sitting there waiting for that report to appear on your screen. Sometimes you get the error message that server gateway, a message like that, too many processes. Basically, you timed out waiting for that report to run. If we're running life to date, do it this way that we're processing here. When the report is ready, you can either come here and look and see if that link is ready for you to click on. Or when you get the email, it's going to look like this. Dear user, the report fiscal year expenses one funding source view has completed processing successfully. So we get that report. Now we know we can go and access the report. So very convenient to have the communication enabled where you're going to get an email once it becomes available. So let's open that HTML report that we've been waiting for. So this is the fiscal year report through today as of March 24th. Here's our budget for this fiscal year. the encumbrances for this fiscal year. The month to date, because we use today's date, means this month is March. If I wanted this information to include February through February 28th, I could have changed the as of date to February 28th, and this month column would have been for February and not March. And then here's our fiscal year to date. We use the March date, so we know that the fiscal year is FY22 with our expenses through today. If we need to change the fiscal year, occasionally I'll get a call with someone who wants to be able to report on activity from the year before this year. We want to go to FY21 or 20 or whatever. You can use these reports and get the same results for the different fiscal year. So if we're going to run the one funding source view report, we'll just run it on screen. As of what day? Well, if I wanted fiscal year 21, I'm going to change the as of date to the last day of FY21. We're including the same stuff, program, checkbook, funding source. And this little date's going to tell us the based on as of date. There's that fiscal year date, and this is that month column. And so now this would be FY21, which we'd be able to then report on to whatever it is we're reporting for FY21, or if we're just gathering information. So some of us have grants that we need to report on for a certain fiscal year. This is how you could do that. And then here's the current report. So we can see the differences with, like, if we look for this attorney fees budget, in FY22, the budget is currently $33,000. FY21, the budget was $91,000. The next report we're going to look at running is the dimension balance report. So we're going to go to General Ledger, and under the reports column, there's a report for dimension balances. On this report, we need to tell it a period of time we want to run the report for. So this one's the general fund account, but if we were going to run a life-to-date report, in the reporting period selection box, there's a period that says inception to date. So we're going to run that. So we're going to have it for the life of that funding source through today. We don't need to enter anything in the opening or closing balance dates because we're going to use this selection. If we enter dates here, that overrides this period of time. So the next thing we need to do is look at our reporting books. Intacct defaults to the accrual book, which is our primary book. This is where all of our revenues and expenses are recorded to. Other books, we don't have anything else selected, so we'll leave it at that for the moment. We get to select if we want to see actual numbers, just the budget, or actual end budget. So I'm going to select actual end budget. Our operating budget in Intacct is called RST budget. So that defaults to there, we're going to leave it there. One of the things you can see when you click here is you can access your draft budgets from prior years or the current year if we were working on FY23, now that's available. So you could access draft budgets if you needed to. But we're going to use the current budget, and we need to tell Intacct what account numbers do we want to run this for. We can select accounts. So if I were looking for just expenses, I'm going to start with the lowest expense number, which starts with a 5. And the highest expense number, which starts with a 9. So this range of accounts is going to be what this report's going to be based on when it runs. If there's only one specific account, then by all means pick the one account. If you're trying to just report on contracts or office supplies or anything like that, totally up to you. You can select multiple accounts, so if they didn't fall in a range but they were in different formats, we could certainly do multiple accounts, select accounts, and then start finding office supplies, travel, and tribal employees, say, if we were reporting on those three things. So this gives us some pretty good versatility in running a report. We can select all accounts, and every account number that has activity is going to come up. Or we can go a little bit further into account group and say, I just want all the expense general ledger accounts. If you don't want to select a range of accounts, you can do it that way too. Our program, our checkbook, our funding source. If we were looking for specific customer, vendor, employee, a line item, like we wanted to report on travel baggage fees or whatever, we could pick that line item there. So there's a question, what's the difference between all expense accounts and all expense accounts general ledger? There is none. They both will give you the same result. And the last thing that we have to do in this report is we have to show some sort of dimension values. If you haven't used the report before, it's going to look like this. It's going to be blank and it's going to say select. If we want to see the account numbers for this report, we can come here and find that. Account ID and name is different in two different areas, so that would give us the answers in two different spots. There is an account ID and name selection so that they'll be together. That's what I'm going to pick. And then the last thing it's going to ask for side by side. Do we want subtotals, grand totals? Well, yeah, of course we want grand totals. Side by side and cascaded, if we're running this report from more than one funding source at a time, this would be a viable way to separate and distinguish on screen how that looks. Select budget comparison. We want budget first and then actual. So we want budget in the first column is what's asking, and then actual in the next column. And then do we want to see a difference between the budget and actual? Absolutely. And there was a comment on one of the registration forms about fitting report data onto a page. If we're running some of these reports, there's an option here to fit one page wide for printing. So you may have to click that if the reports are taking up more than one page for you. So here we are with budget and actual, show difference column. This is for the life of this funding source, inception to date. So we run the report, might take a few seconds. But now a life to date report for this funding source, took like 5 seconds to run. So very convenient for us. We're getting the budget, we're getting what was expensed, and then the difference between that budget and that expenditure. So if you're just wanting to get that information for informational purposes, you don't need it how it looks in a financial report. We've just produced that information quickly and easily. And now we have access to that without having to wait, without having to go through the process and store part of a report, and just doing this very quickly. One thing we didn't do though is we didn't include our encumbrances. So this is our budget and only the actual expenditures for the life of this funding source. So let's keep that in mind with what we're doing here. So we know this column totaled 5.4 million and the difference was 1.7 million. I'm gonna take a screenshot just in case I forget what those amounts were. We're gonna hit customize to come back to our report. So if we're running this and we want to get that information on the differences between what we've spent or what we've obligated in our budget, so we know how much is left to spend, or if we're trying to do a budget mod or something, we have the accrual book selected. We need to add an other book, which is that encumbrance book. We're going to select, choose encumbrances, and here we have an option to combine reporting, which means combine the encumbrances and the accruals. So we're going to do that for this report. We could uncheck this and then only get encumbrances, or we can leave it checked and we're going to get both expenses and encumbrances. So let's run the report again by clicking view. All our other settings we've selected are going to be saved. Now when the report's done running, we're going to get just a little bit difference in the total columns now. Our expenses moved up by $40,000, so our budget available decreased by about $40,000. And so if this funding source was a fund like a 638 contract, IHS contract, a grant that lasts for multiple fiscal years, or a grant that straddles the 2 different fiscal years for the tribe, now we've got an accurate reading of what our budget is, our encumbrances and expenses, and the budget available to continue to spend. And it just took us a few seconds to run it that way. And then from here we have the option to print this report, email it if we wanted to email it to someone else. Up to us. If we hit print, it's a PDF that's going to come out for us. Simple, easy. When we hit print, we get the column that says what period of time is being run. If we customize this report on the bottom screen, we can give it custom titles and a footer. So if we wanted to call it something else than what's there, then by all means, add those titles there. If I had access to multiple funding sources, so I didn't want to specify just the one and I wanted to see those funding sources in this report, I'm going to get rid of this funding source. I may leave this blank because I don't want to specify one. So if we have access to multiple funds, whether it's multiple 638 contracts, IHS, any of that kind of stuff, or if you have more than one general account, we're going to use our program and checkbook selection to be the basis for what funding sources are coming back to us in the report. So any funding source assigned to the general operating program and checkbook 3, general account, are what's going to return in this report. Right now I have it set to display just account ID and name. So if I view this report without making any other change, it's going to gather this information for a lot more funding sources that have access to that combination. So the budget and the expenses and the differences, those change, but we can't tell the difference because there's more than one funding source. So we can't see that here by running this report. This is equivalent in the financial reports to the one funding source view report. So I need to tell Intacct for this dimension balance report, I also want to see the funding source ID. So we're going to come down here and clear that current selection. And we're going to create a new selection with funding source ID, and then back to those account ID and name. We'll leave it at side by side, and then I'm gonna run it as cascaded just so we can see the difference. So now we're getting other funding sources. Here's this 50.170 other is what I was using. And then here's some committee stuff all the way down. Still just took a few seconds to get that done. But if I wanted to see that so it's easier to read and separate it, that option down here is called Cascaded. And if we want to see subtotals between each of the funding sources, we'll click Show Subtotals and run this again by clicking View. Now on screen, this is going to be much easier to read because now this is highlighted. With that, it's separating those funding sources and giving us totals for each fund. Here's the one we were running it for, and then here's the rest of those. and then it'll stay that way if we choose to print the report. And so we can see the little break here by funding source, and then each detail by each of the accounts under each funding source. So dimension balances is by far one of the most probably powerful, versatile reports Intacct added over the last year or so. And on these dimensions, we can do this in so many different things that we have access to run through our accounts, programs, checkbooks, funding sources, customers, vendors. We can display a lot of different information here. And kind of like if you sort in Excel, if you're familiar with Excel, whatever's first is the first thing this report's gonna deliver the report on. And then the next thing is the next thing it'll have of importance, and then so on and so forth. So that's when I do this, that's why we got funding source first and then the account IDs. If we change that and we did account ID first, and then that funding source ID, now here's that account ID and then the funding sources. So our report wouldn't have all the funding sources together. It's by account number now, because that's the way I've ordered it when I told Intacct to show the dimension values in that order. And so we'd get a much bigger, longer report that's summarizing this by account ID now, and then by funding source. So if you're wanting to compare your tribal employee expenses across a bunch of different funding sources, this would be a very easy way to do that. I just got the email from Intacct that the life to date expense one funding source view report is now available. So the life to date report didn't go any faster. It's still going to take some time to run, but now we can go there and access that report. Going to view stored reports, and now those two reports that I ordered by process and store are now both available. That fiscal year one funding source view report that I ran first, that ran almost immediately, and then now this is available. So about a 15-minute time difference in the way that ran, but in that time we've ran like 3 or 4 different versions of a dimension balance report. We stayed busy, not just letting it run on our screen and then possibly getting frustrated if it timed out. Now we can click the link for PDF, and there's that life to date report for that funding source that we ran the report for. As these reports run, you know, it's gonna be that snapshot that we ran it for. So if I wait and run this again, run the access the PDF again tomorrow, the report doesn't change. It's still the information that ran now, not tomorrow, not some other time. So we still need to come back and run another report if we want to access information down the road. If we want to schedule a report, so we're going back to that life to date report to process and store, run the report on. Maybe I want this to run on April 1st. So now we'll have all of March's activity included there, right? Here's that checkbook, that funding, or the program, and then that funding source. As of, when do we want the information as of? If I leave it at March 24th, when this thing runs on April 1st, the data is going to end on March 24th and not include those other days. So if you schedule a report, make sure the as of date is going to match that future day. Intacct's not going to read our intentions. It's going to read what we actually input into these selection areas. And then what format do we want to see that on when it comes to us on April 1st? So maybe I want that as a PDF. Click OK. On April 1st, when we come into work in the morning, we're probably going to have an email from Intacct that says your life to date report's now available to view. Go to view stored reports. So lastly, let's take a look at the purchasing transaction detail blanket purchase order report. That one is not a financial report. So at the beginning of this, I changed this selection place to financial reports. If I started typing the report name, nothing's going to come up because we've limited this page to only being financial reports. This report's a custom report. So I'm going to put it to all applications. Start typing what the report name is, and it's going to start to slowly match whatever other reports match what we're typing. So purchasing transaction detail report, we've done just a whole hour on that report in the last couple of months. We've done an hour on dimension balances. Now we're going to look at this purchasing transaction blanket purchase order detail report. We'll just take a few minutes to do that. This report is only designed to show us blanket purchase orders. What period of time do we want to see the information for? This report defaults to the fiscal current year through the current date. If we needed to change that period, you can either do that by selecting a different period of time, changing your as of date, or inputting a start date and an end date for the time you're looking for. What is our checkbook and program? Our funding source. If there was a certain vendor we're looking for, then by all means use the vendor here. I'm going to leave that blank at this part here. I'm not going to choose vendor, item, or purchasing type. And we're going to go ahead and view what this report will return to us. Now what we get is a summary of each of the types of transactions that were set up as a blanket purchase order. So the first thing is a contract service requisition that was created on March 3rd. We can see that its state is pending, so we opened a $30,000 blanket purchase order and we haven't actually made it a purchase order yet. So it's been sitting there for 3 weeks waiting for us to take activity. So hey, this report's benefiting us if we use this and see that. We see who the vendor is, a memorandum. On the line item, when we put in a memo, we can see what that says. Vendor document number of whatever that is. So here it is. In the quantity field, we put 30,000. We've converted none of it, so we still have 30,000 remaining to use. If it's been used, the quantity converted field would have an amount to show us. And then the remaining amount would be decreased because it would be the quantity minus the quantity converted. And we can see by running this, we have 3 blanket purchase order activities open right now. We have 2 Cherry Todd ones, and there's their link to the purchase orders for those. And there's their quantities, nothing converted. And so the amount's still available. So a valuable report for finding information about our blanket purchase orders. There's no other place you can go in Intacct to get this information in one view. If we go to our purchase order screen, as probably a lot of us do, and we're looking for these pending Cherry Todds. Let's just filter this to pending. We don't get the quantity converted, amount remaining. We don't see the memo, vendor document number. We have none of that on the screen here. We'd have to search that each one of these ones individually to get that information. So there's $483. It's a 2-line one. Here's that report. It's this last one I have highlighted. And now I've done that. I've looked at three purchasing transactions in one report rather than having to jump around between 3 different transactions. So that's the purchasing transaction blanket purchase order report, which is different than the purchasing transaction detail. This report I did training on, the result we get here doesn't show us the balances on blanket purchase orders. This one is designed strictly for blanket purchase orders. Hopefully with a lot of the comments that were shared and the registrations, this answers a lot of those, especially with that process and store. And then that dimension balance report. The dimension balance report, you're gonna have to practice running because it's only gonna work with what you're entering. And that can be frustrating the first couple times you run the report. So it just takes practice to get that right. You can use it for budgets, you don't have to. At the blanket purchase order or the dimension balance report, you don't have to include budget. If you just wanted just your activity, you can do that too. Or if you wanted just your budget, you can do that too. So it's really versatile for that. How you can use that to summarize any of the information you have access to with your funding source or your checkbooks. All right, no questions come in. Thank you everybody for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.